My heart froze when I saw my wife in another man's car on the way to work. I didn't want to believe it, but it was her. The smile on his face, his hand touching his shoulder as if he knew him intimately, as if he belonged in that space. It paralyzed me. The image of the two of them together, exchanging complicit glances like someone who has been sharing secrets for a long time, broke something inside me. I continued driving in silence, trying to convince myself that I could be imagining it. But it wasn't. That scene was the open wound from which my soul began to bleed. They went down a side street, and something stronger than reason made me follow. Every traffic light, every turn they made, I followed. As if you were being dragged by an invisible force. It was no longer curiosity. It was the desperate need to understand. I needed to know how far that betrayal went, how far my life had been a lie. I parked the car 2 blocks back and walked to a cafe where they entered, hand in hand. They sat close together, their hands touching each other naturally, like a couple who had known each other for years. I saw them laughing. She looked at him with that look that I thought was mine alone. There was no room for doubt. It was real. It was physical. It was intimate. And it was older than I imagined. The world around me seemed to spin slowly, as my breathing became heavier. I heard the noise of my blood, like a war drum, echoing inside my head. I sat in the car, and remained there, motionless, for almost an hour, trying to assimilate everything. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, certain that something very serious needed to be done. The following days were like a slow-motion movie. She came home pretending to be the same. He brought my plate, asked me how my day was, touched my arm gently. Kissed me. He slept next to me. He made love to me as if nothing had happened. And everything in me screamed inside. I smiled back, pretended to reciprocate, but something in my eyes must have been different, because even she began to look at me longer, perhaps suspecting something, perhaps just trying to understand what had changed. But she had no idea. I was preparing the end. Not just the end of our marriage, but the end of the illusion she created around me, of the role she thought I would play until the last day of our story. She betrayed me like someone who was on safe ground. And that's when I decided to give back. Not with violence, not with screams, not with scandals. But with precision, with justice, and with a plan that would expose not just the truth, but its consequences. I did what I never imagined doing. I hired an investigator. I wanted more. I wanted to know everything. Who was he? Since when? Where they were? What kind of lies did she use to get out of the house? And when the reports started coming in, each page was a new cut, one open wound on top of another. They went to hotels, used fake names. They had a phone number of their own, weekend trips hidden under banal excuses. She didn't just cheat on me. She had built a new life with him, an entire universe where I was a stranger. But what destroyed me most was discovering that she was using resources that I provided myself. Cards, access, business trips that I booked for her without knowing that I was sending my wife to meet another man. I was an unwitting accomplice in my own ruin. One day, while she was taking a shower, I answered the landline that never rang. A woman on the other end of the line asked in a firm voice, "You're her husband, right?" My throat caught. "I am," I replied. And she continued, "Then you need to know who your wife is getting involved with. He's my husband." The floor disappeared. She was also being deceived. And what this woman told me on that call was the trigger for everything to change once and for all. They had known each other for over a year. They started as colleagues on a professional project, and the relationship evolved in secret. And she discovered it, like me, by chance. But unlike me, she had been planning something for much longer. She was a lawyer. And not just anyone. She was one of the most respected in the city, a specialist in family law. And he had proof. Evidence she was willing to use. We met. For the first time, two betrayed people looking into each other's eyes, trying to understand how they were deceived for so long. She had messages, photos, recordings. I had reports, videos, extracts. Together, we bring everything together. She wanted a divorce. I wanted justice. And then, the plan was born. A plan that involved more than revenge. It involved public exposure of the lie we were living. And every detail was designed with coolness. Because I learned, in that pain, that there are things that love cannot bear. And that, sometimes, silence is the greatest weapon. As she smiled at dinner, I smiled back. While she said she loved me, I said, me too, with a bitter taste in my mouth. Because I knew she had no idea that, soon, everything would change. And she wasn't ready for the consequence. Until the day came. The day I should act. She had left the house saying she was going to a company event. But we knew exactly where she would be. And this time, I didn't go alone. With his wife by my side, we went to the hotel. And we don't knock on the door. We went straight to the manager. The recordings were released with legal authorization. And what we saw there, was visual confirmation of what we already knew. It wasn't just sex. It was intimacy. It was complicity. It was affection. It was the woman who slept next to me, swore her love to me and kissed my forehead before going to sleep, giving herself completely to another man, in a room paid for with the same card that I had entrusted to her. The next morning we delivered everything. 4 lawyers. To the lover's superiors, who worked in the same company as his wife. For her family, who always saw me as the ideal son-in-law. The bomb exploded. And when she arrived home, smiling, bringing me a gift as if nothing had happened, she saw me sitting at the table, with the folder open. There was no screaming. There were no punches. There was silence. And the silence was more deafening than any confrontation. She sat down, confused. And when he saw what was on the table, the color in his face disappeared. She tried to explain, tried to deny. But each test was a blow. Each image, a sentence. She cried. He begged. He said he loved me. That was a mistake. That he didn't want to lose me. And it was there that I looked into her eyes for the last time with any trace of feeling. And he said, "You've already lost me. Now it's time for you to feel what it's like to lose everything you thought you controlled." But she still didn't know what was coming. The scandal was bigger than any of us could have predicted. The lover's wife sued them both for moral damages and breach of prenuptial contract. And in that process, her name was destroyed. Professionally, emotionally, socially. The woman who once paraded safely, now barely managed to go out into the street. What about me? Well, while everyone was waiting for me to isolate myself, rebel or turn into someone bitter, fate, perhaps in a gesture of compassion, introduced me to someone new. A chance meeting, in a cafe in the city where, ironically, she used to go with her lover. And there, without waiting, without looking, something in me began to breathe again. But this part of the story only started after everything burned down. Because before finding peace, I needed to lose myself completely. And deep down, a question still torments me in the quietest of dawns: what if I hadn't looked to the side at that intersection, on that ordinary morning on the way to work, would I still be living a lie? Now that everything has been revealed, there is one last question that may change everything: what did she do after she found out what I did? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, we do not encourage, and we never romanticize betrayal. All stories are fictitious, created to show the impact devastating that disloyalty can cause in the lives of those who truly love. Our objective is clear: reveal how one wrong choice can destroy everything. Get ready, because what you're going to hear now is shocking, intense, and impossible to forget. Good story. Jonathan and Emily seemed made for each other. From their first meetings, there was a naturalness between them that is rarely found. Their gestures fit together, their conversations flowed effortlessly, and the shared silences were comfortable, never awkward. He, a civil engineer for a solid company, was methodical, detail-oriented and had a kind nature. Emily, in turn, ran a small architecture studio, where she designed spaces with soul and poetry. He had a keen sensitivity, a refined aesthetic sense and a deep gaze that always seemed to capture what was not said. They met at a seminar on urban sustainability, when they were both still in the early stages of their careers. All it took was a coffee and a longer look for something to start there. Jonathan was enchanted by the way Emily talked about design like someone talking about love. Emily, on the other hand, found herself surprised by the patience and respect in Jonathan's eyes, a calm she didn't know she needed. They built their lives based on this connection. The wedding came 3 years later, in an intimate, outdoor ceremony, surrounded only by family and closest friends. They bought a house in a leafy neighborhood, with large windows and a balcony for sunset. The two have always valued tranquility and small everyday gestures. On Sundays, they made pancakes together. They had the habit of lying down on the porch hammock to read, even if each one was immersed in a different book. They shared their lives lightly. They had a dog called Milo, a golden retriever who always seemed to smile and who, over time, became the silent link between them during difficult times. Jonathan was stable, one of those men who don't make a big deal out of what they feel, but who are always present. She never forgot an anniversary, no matter how small it was. He always left a note in Emily's lunchbox when she had important meetings. She used to make overly organized shopping lists with categories and subtopics, which always made her laugh. He also had a habit of taking care of everything in the house as if he were an engineer taking care of a bridge. Everything had to be safe, working, balanced. Emily found this adorable, although she was sometimes irritated by the excess control. She was the opposite, intense, emotional, creative to a fault. I would come up with ideas in the middle of the night, scribble projects on napkins and lose track of time in the studio itself. He had a selective memory, which forgot names, but never emotions. He kept old movie tickets and dry leaves between the pages of books. The discussions, when they arose, were more about rhythm than about essence. Emily sometimes felt misunderstood in her volatility, as if Jonathan didn't follow her impulses. Jonathan, on the other hand, was frustrated by Emily's lack of constancy, who changed her mind as easily as changing the color of the studio walls. But they loved each other. And they loved as if they chose themselves, every day. They went to couples therapy once, not because they were feeling bad, but because they wanted to learn how to communicate better. Emily said that love wasn't enough, you had to know how to love the right way. Jonathan agreed, although he had never put it into words. They had friends in common, a balanced social circle, and were seen by everyone as a model couple. You complete each other, those closest said. At parties, they danced together, laughed at silly jokes, exchanged complicit glances. At family events, it was those who brought the most thoughtful gift, who offered help with the dishes, and who stayed until the end. They were never extravagant, but they were always gifts. They had plans to adopt a child in a few years, as Emily could not get pregnant. The evaluation process had already begun. They had dreams for the future, travel, renovations, a winter garden that she wanted to build at the back of the house. Emily wanted to study ceramics, Jonathan thought about opening a small engineering consultancy. And in these conversations about the future, complicity grew even more. The routines were consolidated. Jonathan would leave the house at 7 in the morning after preparing breakfast. Emily stayed at home more, often working from the studio set up upstairs. Sometimes they would have lunch together, sometimes she would have lunch alone. Emily spent a good part of the day between projects, clients, and ideas that appeared without warning. When he returned, usually around 6, they would share the preparation of dinner. They talked about the day, commented on some news, laughed at culinary mistakes. Little by little, without them noticing, the silences became a little longer. The smiles were a little more rehearsed. But nothing alarming. Just the common wear and tear of time, they said. And they followed. Because they loved each other. Because they had built so much. In recent months, however, something has changed in Emily. It was more dispersed, quieter. Sometimes he would stare into space, his eyes fixed on a distant point. Jonathan noticed, but didn't insist. I knew that she was going through a moment of pressure at work, that an important project had been rejected, that she was rethinking some decisions. I tried to be present, more than ever. He ran his hand through her hair when she lay down on the sofa. He left notes with longer messages. She even arranged a surprise weekend trip to a hotel she had always wanted to visit. Emily smiled, thanked him, accepted. But there was something about her smile that wasn't whole. At work, Jonathan was also going through changes. The company was reshaping departments, and he had been promoted. This meant more responsibilities, more meetings, sporadic travel. He tried to balance everything, but he felt divided. I wanted to be with her, but I also wanted to grow up. When he told him the news, Emily listened attentively, but with an expression that he couldn't decipher. "I'm proud of you," she said. But there was a hesitation in the tone that hadn't been there before. Jonathan thought it was just tiredness. Emily has always been sensitive to stress. I didn't want to make a fuss. The weekends remained more or less the same. They went to the park with Milo, cooked together, had some friends over. But there were times when Emily was absent. He said he needed to go to the studio to resolve issues, or visit a client urgently. Jonathan trusted. Always trusted. He had no reason to doubt it. And more than that, he was proud of his independence. I admired the way she led her life, how she was able to do everything with passion. I never wanted to hinder that freedom. On the contrary, he encouraged it. He always believed that the basis of true love was precisely respect for the other's space. During the night, the two slept together, as always. Emily cuddled up to his chest and said it was her favorite place in the world. Jonathan smiled and stroked their backs until they both fell asleep. There was love there. There still was. Jonathan believed this with all his might. Emily, when she woke up in the middle of the night, would sometimes watch his sleeping face. He ran his fingers through his hair gently, as if trying to commit it to memory. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. He just closed his eyes tightly, like someone who needed to erase an uncomfortable thought. The house remained organized, commitments were up to date, finances were balanced. Life was stable, but there was a silent current that began to run through everyday life. Small gestures that previously came spontaneously now seemed calculated. The good morning kiss was shorter, the "I love you's" were more spaced out. Jonathan understood, but he didn't want to admit it. I thought it was a phase. That everything would return to normal when the pace slowed down. Emily said everything was fine. That I was just exhausted. And he believed. Because he was the kind of man who chose to trust. On one of those nights, sitting at the table, Jonathan talked about the idea of doing a new photo shoot together. Emily smiled, said she loved the idea, but looked away. He suggested resuming couples therapy sessions, just to reconnect. She hesitated for a second, then said yes, that would be good. But he never scored. Jonathan didn't insist. I didn't want to pressure. I was trying to be the safe haven. I just didn't know that sometimes even ports need shelter. And it was in this scenario, of smiles that hid silences, of routines that masked gaps, of an apparently intact house with small cracks, that something began to emerge. There were still no explosions. There were still no clashes. But there was an absence of fullness, a muffled intuition, a growing emptiness between two bodies that still slept together. Because sometimes, the greatest distance between two people is not measured in meters, but in looks that no longer meet. And there, in that routine that seemed safe, in the heart of a relationship built with so much care, the storm began to brew. Silent. Undercover. And inevitable. For weeks, Jonathan ignored the uneasiness that was silently growing inside him. It was a strange sensation and discomfort that he tried to attribute to tiredness, pressure at work, the inevitable changes of adult life. Emily was increasingly absent, not in physical presence, but emotionally. His words came late, his answers seemed rehearsed. Jonathan observed every detail, not wanting to believe that there was anything wrong. Sometimes he would sit on the sofa and see her far away, her gaze lost between the living room curtains, as if she was waiting for something he couldn't offer. He tried to fill that space with flowers, coffee in bed, small surprises, but nothing seemed to break that invisible wall that had risen between the two. Her hand still touched him, but there was an impersonal lightness, like someone performing a ritual. And although the gestures remained, the heat in them had diminished. One afternoon, returning early from work after canceling a meeting, Jonathan decided to stop by Emily's studio to bring her coffee and a slice of pie that she loved. When he arrived, he found the door ajar, the light on and low music playing in the background. He called his name twice, with no response. Entered. The table was full of papers, sketches and notes, but she wasn't there. Emily's cell phone was vibrating on the counter, with a notification visible that he had no intention of reading, but he did. It was a message from a contact saved only as L. The short, contextless phrase, "I'm already in my usual place, waiting for you," was enough to freeze the moment. Jonathan stood still, his eyes fixed on that glowing piece of screen, his heart slowing as if he needed time to process. "I didn't want to assume anything." He left the studio slowly, left the coffee on the table and didn't say anything that night. Emily came back saying she had a tiring meeting, complained about the traffic, kissed his forehead and went to take a shower. Jonathan smiled, nodded and just watched. In the days that followed, he tried to look for a logical explanation, a plausible justification. Maybe it was a client, maybe it was a friend, maybe I was just imagining things. But doubt began to take shape, to infiltrate the spaces previously occupied by trust. And then, one Tuesday night, as Emily slept soundly beside him, Jonathan carefully got up, went to his office, and turned on his computer. It wasn't like him to invade anyone's privacy, but he felt he needed to understand what was happening. Opened shared email, searched folders, documents, calendars. Nothing compromising. But on instinct, he accessed a reservation history of hotels used for events and meetings. There was a recent reservation there, for a downtown hotel, in her name. A check-in for the previous week. There was no business trip scheduled. He remembered it perfectly. That didn't make sense. But now everything was starting to get mixed up. The absences, the mechanical smiles, the lost looks. Jonathan closed the computer and sat in the dark, staring at his reflection in the window. There was no more room for assumptions. It was time to find out. Without Emily knowing, she hired someone. A trusted, discreet acquaintance who had done this type of work before. Jonathan didn't want to expose his life or create scandals. "I just wanted to know the truth." The photos arrived 3 days later. They were left in a discreet envelope, inside his briefcase at work. He didn't open it right away. He stared at the envelope like someone looking at a sentence. When he finally worked up the courage, he opened it with shaking hands and saw it. It was her. Sitting in a coffee shop, smiling at someone who wasn't him. In another image, the two walked out together, side by side, hands almost touching. The next sequence was the hardest to watch. Emily, entering a familiar hotel with the man. Jonathan couldn't finish looking. He put everything back in the envelope, took a deep breath and felt nausea rising from his stomach. That night, Emily arrived more excited than usual. She said she was thinking about redecorating the studio, asked what he thought about changing the arrangement of the furniture in the room, and spoke enthusiastically about a client who wanted to expand the project into an art gallery. Jonathan heard her, but her voice sounded distant, as if she were speaking from another life. He nodded, agreed, smiled. The sound of betrayal hadn't left his eyes yet. And even there, in that room that still smelled of coffee and lavender, love was crumbling in silence. In the following days, Jonathan began to live in a state between lucidity and denial. He began to observe more, pay attention to details, analyze schedules and speeches. Emily said she was going to meetings, but the shared location on her cell phone showed something different. He began to create a silent timeline, to connect the dots. The dates matched the absences. The stories lined up with the alibis. Jonathan wanted to believe that this could just be a phase, an oversight, an isolated mistake. But everything around him screamed otherwise. The woman sleeping next to him was leading a parallel life, and he was the last to know. The definitive confirmation came on an ordinary morning. Jonathan left for work later. Emily had said she had a meeting out of town. She kissed her cheek, grabbed her bag and hurried away. But instead of going to work, Jonathan took the car and discreetly followed the path she was taking. He followed the journey with his heart hammering in his chest. Every curve, every traffic light, every stop, was a shot in the dark. Until, at an intersection, he saw Emily's car turn right and park in front of a discreet restaurant. She went downstairs and, a few minutes later, the man in the photos appeared. They hugged each other intimately. Emily smiled. The same smile that was just his before. Jonathan stood in the car, a few meters away. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just felt an emptiness that he couldn't fit inside of himself. He stayed there, watching the scene like someone watching their own life fall apart through their fingers. Later, when she returned home, she acted normally. He said the meeting had been tiring, commented on the heavy traffic, and asked if he wanted dinner. Jonathan answered yes, cooked for both of them, laughed at some joke, and then, when it was time to sleep, he hugged her like he always did. Emily gave herself into the hug, without realizing that something had changed in that man forever. From that day on, Jonathan began to act with surgical precision. He didn't confront, he didn't accuse. He just watched. He kept evidence, cross-referenced information, silently constructed what would become his answer. During breakfast, he talked about trivialities, but inside, he planned the end. Emily, oblivious, continued with her forced smiles, her well-structured excuses, her well-rehearsed absences. The theater continued, but Jonathan was no longer an audience member. He was the author of the next act. The weight of maintaining that appearance, of living with the known lie, began to affect Jonathan. He started sleeping less and lost his appetite. But there was something stronger than the pain, the need to do justice. Not justice in the banal sense of revenge, but something deeper. He wanted Emily to feel what he felt. I wanted her to see her own mask crumble. And, above all, I wanted her to understand that every choice has a price. And that, this time, he wouldn't be the only one to pay. When he decided to take the first step, he was discreet. He separated documents, consulted lawyers, organized evidence. He put the envelope in a safe and started planning. I knew the right moment was close. And when it arrived, there would be no going back. Emily, increasingly distant, continued her double life with blind trust. He thought he was fooling a man who only observed in silence. But I didn't know that that silence was the prelude to a storm. It was on a Friday, late in the afternoon, that everything culminated. Jonathan left work early. He was driving home when, as he stopped at the light, he saw in front of him, in the car in front of him, the back of the head that he knew so well. It was her car. And the man next to him was neither a customer nor a colleague. It was him. The same as the photos. Same with hugs. Jonathan followed. He saw the two talking intimately, he saw smiles, hands touching, eyes searching each other. He continued to a familiar parking lot. He saw the two enter the same hotel in the photo. There was no more room for doubt. The betrayal was complete. That night, Jonathan didn't come home. Didn't answer calls. Didn't respond to messages. He remained silent. The city slept and he, awake, contemplated the end. But there was still something Emily didn't know. Something she hadn't even imagined. Something that, when revealed, would change not only the course of the story, but everything she believed she knew about the consequences of her choices. Jonathan spent the entire weekend in silence. He didn't answer messages, he didn't answer calls, he didn't leave the house. He walked around the room with empty eyes, stopping from time to time to look at the folder that rested on the table, where all the documents, photos and audios were organized with surgical precision. Every piece of evidence of Emily's betrayal was there, stacked, categorized, dated. But that night, as he stared at the reflection of his own face in the glass on the balcony, betrayal was no longer at the center of his thoughts. It was the secret. That revelation that I had received days before, in an unexpected phone call, and that transformed all the pain into something even greater, more absurd, more corrosive. He knew that once he said it out loud, there would be no going back. It was like lighting a fuse that ended in a powder keg. And he was ready to blow everything up. On Monday, returning from work, Emily was at home, as if nothing had happened. She wore a light blouse, her hair tied up in an unassuming way, and was preparing tea in the kitchen. When she heard the door open, she smiled like someone who still felt safe. Jonathan returned a long, firm look that she couldn't decipher. They ate dinner in silence. The cutlery touched the plates with a dry sound, interrupted by the dense breathing that filled the room. Emily tried to start a conversation, commented about a new project that would start the following week, but Jonathan just nodded, without going deeper. When they finished, he got up, put the dishes in the sink, and instead of going to the bedroom as usual, he came back to the living room and said in the calmest voice she had ever heard, "We need to talk." Emily followed him to the sofa, sat down next to him, restless. There was something different in his tone. Something between tiredness and absolute firmness. Jonathan looked into her eyes for long seconds, as if he needed to register every feature of that face. And then he said, bluntly, "I know." She froze. The hands fluttered lightly over the legs. Jonathan didn't scream. He didn't raise his voice. He just continued, "I know everything. I know who he is, I know the places you've been, I know the times, the meetings, the disguises. I've known for weeks. And yet, I was here. Observing. Waiting." Emily tried to react, but her throat caught. When he finally managed to articulate something, his voice was choked, shaky. "It's not what you think," she began, but he interrupted with a firmness he had never used with her. "Please don't lie. Don't try to smooth it out. You betrayed me." And she did it with the tranquility of someone who thinks she will never be discovered. She lowered her head, covered her face with her hands and began to cry. The words took a while to come out. She said she was confused, that she felt alone, that she didn't know who she was anymore. Jonathan listened to her without reacting, just letting her spill everything. And then, just as calmly, he got up, went to the folder on the table, opened it and spread the photos on the sofa. Emily looked at those images as if she were in front of a broken mirror. In each piece, she saw herself torn apart, exposed, naked in her lie. She tried to touch the photos, but Jonathan collected them all before she could. He didn't want compassion. I wanted truth. I wanted her to feel the weight of the choices she had made. And then, after a long silence, he said, "There's something you need to know. Something that changes everything." Emily looked at him with her eyes still teary, without imagining that the worst hadn't yet been revealed. Jonathan took a deep breath, passed his hand over his face and, with a choked voice, began to count. Last week, when he received the latest evidence from the investigation, there was something more. A copy of documents. Legal information. A complete dossier delivered by a woman named Lara, the wife of Lucas, the man Emily was having a relationship with. Lara had discovered the betrayal shortly before Jonathan. But, unlike him, he didn't just seek to expose the lie. She wanted to destroy her lover and accomplice. And he had a powerful resource for this, a prenuptial contract signed by Lucas years before, in which he swore loyalty under heavy clauses. According to this contract, any serious moral misconduct, such as infidelity, would result in the total loss of rights to the goods and assets acquired during the marriage. What's more, the contract provided for compensation for emotional damage, with very high amounts. Jonathan looked her in the eyes and continued, "You didn't know, but Lucas is married to one of the most feared lawyers in the city. And now, she has proof. Lots of audios, videos, confessions." Emily turned pale. Breathing became short. He tried to say something, but Jonathan raised his hand in a restrained gesture, asking for silence. "Not only will she sue her own husband, she has already filed a lawsuit against you. For moral damages. By conscious involvement with a married man. For the consequences of his presence in the destruction of an entire family." Emily put her hand over her mouth, her skin already in a cold sweat, her eyes wide. But Jonathan wasn't finished yet. "There is more. Lara has direct connections with investors in public projects, including some who hired her studio in the last 2 years. And she guaranteed, in all letters, that she will prevent any new contracts of hers with bodies or companies associated with her name. Your career, Emily, is in ruins. Not because of me. But because you crossed paths with someone who is not willing to forgive." Emily got up and started pacing back and forth, muttering disjointed words. He tried to cling to any justification, any argument that justified what he had done. She said she didn't know, that she never wanted to hurt him, that she lost herself. Jonathan didn't respond. He sat down on the sofa, looked at his hands and remained silent. The sound of Emily's footsteps on the floor echoed like a clock counting down the seconds until the final collapse. Until she stopped in front of him, knelt down, held his hands and said, "Forgive me, please, I don't want to lose you. I made the worst mistake of my life. I love you. I still love you." Jonathan looked at her with teary but firm eyes. "You love the idea of me. The man who protects you, who supports you, who guarantees you stability. But you never really saw me. You built a character around me. And now that this character has fallen, all that's left is the truth." She cried, begged, tried to rebuild what was already broken. Jonathan got up, walked to his room, picked up a packed suitcase and came back. Emily followed him in desperation. "Where are you going? What are you going to do?" He replied without hesitation, "I will give you space to reflect. And when I return, it will no longer be to this house. I have already filed for divorce." Emily sat on the floor, hands over her face, body shaking. Jonathan stopped for a moment, looked back, and concluded, perhaps the cruelest thing about betrayal is not the act itself, but the fact that the moment you commit it, you don't calculate everything that will be destroyed. And now, everything was gone. He left. The silence remained. And with it, the weight of ruin. But what Emily still didn't know was that Jonathan wasn't leaving forever. He still had something saved. Something that would change the outcome of this story in a way that not even Lara could predict. Jonathan spent the first 2 days away from home, staying in a small hotel on the coast, just a few hours away. Not for escape, but for precision. He needed silence, distance and a neutral space where he could see his own story as if he were in front of a screen, observing himself as a character in a plot that he had not chosen to live. Emily's messages were piling up on her cell phone. Some long, others short and desperate. He didn't read any. All it took was seeing her name coming up to feel a physical repulsion, a raw feeling running up your spine. Still, it didn't block. Not out of hope, but because I knew that all of that was still necessary. Those tracks would come in handy later, and Jonathan was a man who left no loose ends. On the morning of the third day, after a walk by the sea, he decided to answer Lara's call. The conversation was direct, practical. She informed him that the case against Emily was still ongoing and that, as expected, the pressure placed on partner companies was already beginning to have an effect. A major design firm had cancelled a proposed partnership with Emily's studio that morning. Lara reported the facts with admirable coolness, but at the end of the call, her voice wavered briefly. "Jonathan, you noticed. She was breaking inside too, she just knew how not to show it." And there was a silent complicity between two betrayed people who chose to face their pain with grace, without scandals, without blind revenge, but with firmness. When they hung up, Jonathan knew it was time to go back. Not to the house. But at the end of all that. It was on a cloudy afternoon that he appeared unexpectedly in Emily's studio. She was alone, hunched over a drafting table. Upon seeing him, her eyes filled with an almost childish relief, and she immediately dropped everything to run to him. Jonathan took 2 steps back, raising his hand, signaling that there was no room for touching. Emily stopped, embarrassed, and her eyes fell into mute sadness. He didn't say anything right away. He just walked slowly through the space, observing the paintings, the plants, the scattered papers. The surroundings looked the same, but there was a silent disorder, as if even the objects had been affected by the guilt that hung in the air. Jonathan finally turned and asked with a strange calm, "Do you have any idea what's going on out there?" Emily hesitantly replied that she had received cancellation emails, cold calls from former partners, a kind of collective silence coming from all sides. He said he didn't understand the scale of it, that he was scared. Jonathan moved just close enough to look her in the eye and said dryly, "You have no idea, Emily. What you started was a chain reaction. And now you will feel everything you caused, not because of me, but because of the inevitable consequences of your choices." She tried to argue, asked for a second chance, said that she loved the work she did, that she couldn't bear the idea of losing him, but Jonathan was no longer there for her. It was for him. I needed to end that cycle with lucidity. He advised her that the divorce documents were already in the possession of her lawyer. That the division of assets was being done within the limits of legality, but that, emotionally, she had already lost everything. Emily sat down, shaken, and there, for the first time, was completely silent. Jonathan walked to the door, but before leaving, he threw out one last sentence: "Sometimes, what destroys is not what was done, but everything that could have been, and will never be again." And he left, leaving her alone with the echo of her own choices. In the days that followed, the town seemed to turn its back on Emily. Clients began to cancel contracts, friends disappeared from networks, social invitations stopped. The reputation built over the years slipped through his fingers like dry sand. Emily began to live cloistered, avoiding going out, trying to erase traces of her own digital existence. His expression no longer carried its usual haughtiness. He walked through the rooms of the house, now empty, as if looking for something he lost without realizing it. He tried to get back in touch with Lucas, but he had completely disappeared. Lara had moved her pieces masterfully. And Emily now felt the raw, sharp loneliness of someone who chose to destroy what they had, believing they had control over the effects. Jonathan, on the other hand, had moved into a small apartment downtown. He was slowly starting to reconnect with himself. Read more, write. He was visiting a former literature professor who had always told him that great collapses precede the greatest rebirths. One morning, as he stopped for coffee at a small bookstore, he noticed a woman sitting at the next table, reading the same book he was carrying under his arm. Their eyes met by chance. She smiled. It was a light smile, without intentions, just the reflection of an uncontaminated peace. He exchanged a few words with her about the author, about her taste for silent cafes. Jonathan left without asking for the number, taking his time. But something had changed. The weight in his chest, for the first time in a long time, felt lighter. Meanwhile, Emily received formal notification that her participation in an important architectural competition had been revoked. The committee cited ethical issues linked to professional integrity as justification. She read the document 3 times, sitting on the bathroom floor, with the door locked. When he finished reading, he started laughing. A nervous, shaky, uneven laugh. There was nowhere else to run. He called his mother, but gave up before the 3rd ring. He called Lara impulsively, but the call went straight to voicemail. Then, in a last gesture of desperation, he wrote a long letter to Jonathan. He said he knew everything was lost, but he needed to write. That he didn't want his forgiveness, nor pity. But she wanted him to know that she had been loved, yes. That, even with all the confusion, she loved him. And if she could go back, she would never have allowed vanity, boredom and lack to ruin what she herself considered sacred. He didn't send the letter. He kept it in a box, along with old photos, travel tickets, newspaper clippings with the first projects they signed together. He closed everything with duct tape and hid it in the attic. A week later, while leaving to go to the market, Emily passed Lara on the sidewalk. The two looked at each other for a second, long enough for a decade of feelings to permeate that moment. Lara was calm, without any trace of revenge. Just firm. Emily, hesitant, just mumbled an almost inaudible, "I'm sorry." Lara looked at her with calculated coldness and simply replied, "I hope you learn." And he continued on his way. Emily stood still, staring into space. There he understood, once and for all, that some scars are not visible, but they shape everything that comes after. Jonathan met the woman from the bookstore 2 weeks later, by chance, or maybe not. Her name was Helena. He worked on restoring old books. He had a calm voice and a look that conveyed truth. They talked for long hours about literature, silence, pain and rebirth. She didn't ask invasive questions. I just listened. And that was, for Jonathan, the most revolutionary gesture of recent times. For the first time, he felt like trying. Not to forget Emily, but to allow the past to take its place. And that night, as he walked alone down the street, feeling the warm city wind touch his face, Jonathan understood that he had not been defeated. He had survived. And sometimes, surviving is the closest thing to victory anyone can get. But when he got home, he found an envelope slipped under the door. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Emily. There was no longer any resentment in his eyes. Just curiosity. He opened it slowly, read each line of the letter in silence. When he finished, he looked out the window and took a deep breath. He didn't respond. But I knew that, in that letter, she had finally told the only truth she could tell. The truth about yourself. What she would do with it, was no longer his problem. Jonathan kept the letter at the bottom of a drawer and didn't talk about it to anyone. It was no longer a question of raising hopes or sorrows, it was simply the end of a communication that no longer belonged to the present. I had read each line carefully, absorbing the words like someone reading an emotional testament of someone who died a long time ago. The words were filled with regret, contained despair and a request for redemption that he could no longer offer. But there was no anger when I finished reading, just a strange compassion, the kind of compassion that comes when you see someone fall apart alone, and yet refuse to see that everything is already gone. He didn't want revenge anymore, he didn't want Emily to suffer any more than she was already suffering. What she faced now was no longer because of the actions of others, but because of the choices she made, the lies she cultivated and the promises she broke to herself long before breaking up with him. In the days that followed, Jonathan's life took on a new rhythm, slower, more sensible, with a tranquility that was not the absence of pain, but maturity in the face of it. He began to reformulate his space, moving the furniture around, painting the walls in lighter tones, cutting the ties that still tied his space to the story that ended. It wasn't about forgetting, but about making space for something different to grow. Helena continued to appear in small doses, as someone who respected the timing of things, and this comforted him. There were no promises, no inflated expectations. Just honest company. He started to frequent the cafe where they met more frequently, and there they would talk about different topics, as if the painful past was just an additional layer, not the center of the narrative. Jonathan didn't talk about Emily with Helena, and she didn't ask. And that respectful silence was one of the reasons he felt peace with her. On the other side, Emily was slowly sinking into noisy solitude. I tried to occupy my time with mechanical activities, such as tidying drawers, rearranging books, cleaning forgotten corners. But it all seemed just an empty effort to camouflage emptiness. The studio, once his creative refuge, was now just a deserted space, with contracts suspended, clients absent and a phone that no longer rang. He tried to restart some personal projects, but the lack of purpose sapped his energy. Ideas that previously came naturally now came with effort and lackluster. She began to question not just her recent choices, but her entire trajectory. I wanted to understand at what point she stopped seeing the value of small things, at what point she started to get lost within herself and ignore the signs that something inside her had been asking for help for a long time. Nights were the worst time. The silent house, the empty rooms, the ghosts of what once was. She sat on the bed and faced the wall, remembering the dialogues, the laughter, the simple candlelit dinners that seemed banal, but today seemed like relics. She remembered a Sunday when Jonathan spent hours repairing a shelf for his books and, in the end, made a dedication hidden behind the wood with a black pen, a phrase she only discovered months later. Everything I build for us. Emily touched her chest as if she could hold the pain in her hands, but it ran like water between her fingers. There was no way to erase the past, nor go back in time. And now, she had to deal with what was left, herself, stripped of everything, forced to look within like she had never done before. In this process, Emily began to seek therapeutic help. Not out of an attempt to win Jonathan back, but out of a belated impulse to understand who she was before everything fell apart. The sessions were difficult, raw, full of uncomfortable silences and internal confrontations. It was there that for the first time she was able to express that she never really knew how to love. Who always confused intensity with connection, and attention with affection. Who got used to being desired, but never learned to be constant. And that deep down, she betrayed not only Jonathan, but she betrayed herself every time she pretended to be something she wasn't. The process was slow but liberating. And for the first time, Emily cried not because of the loss, but because of the recognition of the wounds she had carried since before she met any of the men she had been with. He no longer sought redemption from the outside, he sought reconstruction from within. Meanwhile, Jonathan needed to deal with the social and family consequences of the breakup. People close to him still asked him about Emily, others offered opinions he never solicited. But he learned to filter, to respond politely and to follow his path without carrying the weight of other people's expectations. He started investing in a new professional project, something more focused on consultancy and mentoring for young engineers, something that gave him purpose without consuming his soul. And this transition made him realize how much he himself had lost himself in a routine that no longer served him. The betrayal shook him violently, but it also pushed him out of a comfort zone that, deep down, was already a prison. One afternoon, he received an invitation to speak at an event about collaborative architecture and engineering. He hesitated. The theme connected him directly to what he and Emily had lived and created together for years. But he decided to accept. He prepared his presentation rigorously, including references and ideas he learned throughout the pain, including about resilience, adaptation and how projects, like relationships, require constant maintenance. On the day of the event, when he got on stage, he felt his hands sweating, but he maintained his posture. The audience was attentive. Among the faces, he identified Helena's firm gaze in the last row. And in that instant, I knew I was in the right place. He spoke for almost an hour, without notes, with a lucidity that surprised even himself. At the end, he received a standing ovation. And when he got off the stage, Helena approached him and hugged him without saying anything. And he knew he didn't need to hear anything. It was enough. Later, when they arrived together at their usual café, she finally asked, gently, "Would you forgive?" Jonathan took a while to respond. He looked at the cup in his hands, felt the hot steam rising and, with a low voice, said that forgiveness is an internal process, not a gesture towards others. That I had learned not to carry hatred, but also not to forget. That forgiveness, for him, was a movement of personal liberation, and not an invitation to reconciliation. And that, deep down, forgiving did not mean allowing the return of those who left. Helena nodded, without insisting. And this silent respect sealed a pact between them. They didn't need to heal each other, but they could grow together. No rush. No promises. The following week, Emily received a letter from the Professional Ethics Committee informing her that although legal penalties were ongoing, there was still room for her to start over under new conditions. It wasn't a pardon, but a chance. She cried as she read it, not out of relief, but because she realized she would have to start over from the ground up. She called an old friend and, for the first time in months, arranged a lunch date. She arrived hesitantly, was greeted with surprise, but listened. He didn't ask for mercy, he just spoke sincerely. He told what he experienced, what he faced, what he learned. And at that lunch, he understood that the world had not ended. That shame didn't need to be eternal, and that, perhaps, reconstruction wasn't about going back to what it was, but rather about becoming someone new from the ashes. Jonathan, in turn, continued to build his new path. One day, while sorting through an old folder of documents, he found a forgotten photo of him and Emily at an impromptu picnic. He laughed wistfully. It didn't tear. He just put it back in the briefcase and put it away somewhere high. It was no longer an open wound. It was a scar. And he knew that even deep scars, over time, lose their pain. But they never lose what they teach. And at that moment, without rushing, without promises, he was preparing for something he might never have imagined possible months before, truly starting over. Because love may end, but life, when we choose to continue, always finds a way to blossom where no one expected. It was on a rainy morning that Jonathan woke up with a restless mind. I had slept little, but not out of sadness. He had woken up several times during the night, assaulted by old memories that no longer hurt, only came as distant echoes of a life that seemed to have belonged to someone else. The sound of rain hitting the pane brought a strange, almost anesthetic comfort. He got up slowly, made coffee, watched the steam rising from the cup as if that were the only thing that mattered. In recent days, he had removed himself from social media, cancelled non-essential commitments, and immersed himself in deep reflection about what came next. I felt like I was ready for a new cycle, but there was still something missing. It was not a reunion with the past, nor a search for reconciliation. It was a final, silent agreement between him and what he once believed to be indestructible. He then decided that he needed to see Emily. Not to reopen wounds or to seek any justification. I already knew that there was nothing she said that could change what was already clear. But there were words he needed to say. Words that never fit in the midst of pain, anger, or coldness. I wanted, for the first time, to be heard by her without it meaning begging for understanding or trying to keep something standing. I just wanted to say. Helena's presence didn't stop him, on the contrary. She understood his need to truly end the previous cycle, and supported without invading. When Jonathan called Emily and suggested a brief meeting, she accepted without hesitation. Her voice on the other end was barely a whisper, filled with a vulnerability he didn't know. They arranged to meet in a discreet park, in the late afternoon, away from people and stories. When he arrived, he found Emily sitting on a wooden bench, huddled inside a dark coat. She was thinner, paler, and her gaze seemed to carry the absence of many good nights' sleep. When she saw him, she stood up with an involuntary gesture, as if she still allowed herself to react with her body before her reason. Jonathan stopped in front of her and, without touching, without smiling, he just said, "Thank you for coming." They sat in silence, listening to the sound of birds and the snapping of branches in the wind. After a long time, he began to speak, not in anger, but with a serenity that hurt. She said that, for years, she built an idea of happiness that depended on her. That you created a world where every detail revolved around the security you thought the two of you shared. Who believed, in an almost childish way, that it was enough to do everything right for everything to work out. Emily listened without interrupting, her hands clasped between her knees, her eyes fixed on an undefined point ahead. Jonathan continued, explaining that what destroyed him most was not the act itself, but the indifference she showed while lying. The naturalness with which he left the house, with which he looked into your eyes, with which he said he still loved while destroying everything behind. She said that she had to rebuild herself completely, that she spent nights trying to understand where she had failed, until she realized that it was not a failure, but a unilateral choice on her part. And that, although she had every right to change, he deserved to know. He deserved to be treated like a partner, even if it was to break up. Emily began to cry softly, tears flowing effortlessly, wetting the cuffs of her coat. He tried to say something, but Jonathan gently raised his hand, asking him to continue. He said that, despite everything, he didn't hate her. And that was the hardest thing to explain. That love was over, but that I hadn't managed to turn it into hate. That the memory of what they experienced still had a protected place within him, and that he hoped, from the bottom of his heart, that she could find a way to rise again. Emily finally spoke. He said he spent months destroying himself inside, trying to understand how he managed to let everything fall apart on impulse. That nothing she experienced with the other man was real, and that she realized too late that what she was looking for was not a new love, but an escape from herself. That the betrayal wasn't against him, but against everything she knew was right. That was lost. And that losing Jonathan was the shock that made her wake up to the kind of person she had become. She said she didn't expect to be forgiven, but that she needed to be grateful that he walked away without destroying her completely. That he could have ended his reputation, his life, but he chose dignity. Jonathan listened, and although his eyes were moist, his heart no longer bled. In the end, the two remained silent, side by side, without touching, just contemplating the ruin between them. And there, without ceremony, Jonathan said goodbye for good. In the days that followed, Emily continued the therapeutic process and began teaching young architecture students. He drastically reduced his presence on social media, closed his old studio and started working on small, voluntary projects in needy communities. It was his way of trying to give back to the world some of the dignity he had lost. He no longer sought redemption through image, but through silent surrender. I relearned how to live with little, calmly, with truth. I still received suspicious looks, especially from former colleagues, but I dealt with it with my head held high. He knew that his reputation would take time to recover, perhaps it would never recover completely, but he also knew that his new version no longer needed approval so much. Jonathan, on the other hand, received a proposal to participate in an international initiative focused on innovation in sustainable engineering. It would be necessary to move for 6 months. When talking to Helena about this, she listened carefully and replied without hesitation that he should accept it. That it was not an escape, but an expansion. And that, if paths crossed again later, it would be by choice and not by dependence. Jonathan was moved. I was used to relationships in which everything was dramatized, where any change of direction was seen as abandonment. That was new. Clean. And liberating. He accepted the proposal. And in the weeks before his departure, they lived together simply, quiet dinners, long conversations, afternoons in shared silence. They didn't make promises, they just lived. The day before the trip, Helena accompanied him to the station. They walked hand in hand, and when they said goodbye, she said, you deserve to start over with a light soul. Jonathan smiled, hugged her for a long time and left. During the trip, he looked out the window and thought about everything that had happened in the last few months. He felt grateful that he hadn't allowed the pain to turn him into someone bitter. And above all, he felt that, for the first time in a long time, he had no one inside him but himself. He was a whole man, rebuilt with his own hands. And ready for whatever came. Because I had discovered, the hard way, that love is only valuable when it is reciprocated, and that loyalty to oneself is the only loyalty that cannot be negotiated. The rest, life teaches you the rest. The snow was falling lightly when Jonathan landed at the international airport. The cold bit his skin, but he didn't mind. It was as if each icy particle brought a vivid memory of what he left behind, but also reminded him that he was in new territory, where the past no longer had the same weight. Those 6 months would be more than a professional mission, they would be a dive into the essence itself. He had honestly left everything behind. He made a point of not carrying emotional baggage or committing to fragile promises. Helena remained in his memory like a affection, a symbol that there was still room for true relationships, but he didn't want to rush or definitive answers. I wanted to live the now fully, breathe new air and allow time to put everything in its place. His days were filled with rich exchanges with professionals from different parts of the world, with projects that required focus and with small everyday joys, such as discovering a local bakery, talking to a stranger on the subway or simply walking along unfamiliar streets without a destination. And, on these walks, he realized that he was finally free, not in the empty sense of the absence of ties, but in the mature freedom of someone who knows how to consciously choose what they want to keep close. Meanwhile, Emily faced the hardest of mirrors, that of conscience. She had rebuilt part of her routine, established new professional commitments, reconnected with a few valuable friendships, but inside she still carried a weight that no social project could alleviate. There were nights when I woke up scared, not from nightmares, but from the sudden realization that I had become, by choice, someone who hurt the person who offered me the most love. His therapy sessions became more intense. There, she began to confront old truths, not just about the betrayal itself, but about the emotional needs that she had always masked with intense and inconstant relationships. She had to face her unstable childhood, her destructive patterns, her fear of being rejected, her addiction to approval. He cried like he had never cried before. He screamed, fell silent, sank into a solitude that was now assumed to be part of the process. He stopped seeking reconciliation with Jonathan, not out of giving up, but out of respect. He understood that, no matter how much regret there was, the love that once united them could not, and should not, be resurrected. And over time, this acceptance gave him peace. It still wasn't happiness, but it was dignity. And for her, at that stage in her life, this was already a new beginning. Lucas, the man with whom Emily had a hidden romance, suffered a different fate. He tried to maintain the appearance of normality, but the impact of the lawsuit that Lara filed against him was deeper than he expected. He lost his prominent position in the company, was removed from important projects and saw his reputation turn to dust. He tried to get around the situation by portraying himself as the victim of a suffocating marriage, but no one else was willing to listen to convenient versions. Lara, in turn, stood her ground. He used his influence to remove him with dignity, without scandals, but with assertiveness. He moved the pieces with elegance and removed him not just from the house, but from life. Lucas began to live alone in a rented apartment, with limited visits to his children, trying to rebuild a life where his name no longer had the weight it once had. The blow he received came not only from material losses, but from the realization that, while he believed he was in control, he had been just another replaceable piece on the board of wrong choices. He was a free man, yes, but the echo of failure accompanied him in each new step. Lara, on the other hand, experienced a different process of reconstruction. It wasn't easy to go through all that without breaking down. But she knew that some pains come to take away from us what was already corroded. He decided to take a sabbatical, travel, reconnect with places and people he had left behind due to his demanding routine. It was during this hiatus that she rediscovered an old flame, someone she knew even before Lucas. An unhurried reunion, without expectations of the future, but full of the present. For the first time in years, he felt like he could love without needing to prove anything to anyone. Her career remained solid, now more focused on social causes, helping women in processes of separation and emotional reconstruction. He found real purpose where once there was only reputation. And over time, he became a reference not only for what he did, but for how he chose to react to pain. 6 months have passed. Jonathan concluded his season away with the feeling of mission accomplished. He was no longer the same man who left. It carried a new lightness, a more compassionate maturity and an unshakable certainty that we cannot avoid being betrayed, but we can always decide how we react to it. When he returned, he did not immediately look for Helena. I needed to understand where I was emotionally. But destiny, as always silent and precise, brought them face to face in a downtown bookstore, just like in the beginning. She saw him first, waved the book in her hands, and he approached with a sincere smile. They talked for hours, as if no time had passed. They didn't say anything about taking back what they left. They just enjoyed that moment. And when they left together, they did so walking side by side, without holding hands, but with their steps in harmony. It was as if everything was finally in the right place. Months later, Jonathan wrote a book. Not about betrayal, but about emotional reconstruction. He mixed fiction and experience with mastery, transforming pain into literature. The book gained popularity among readers and was adopted by support groups, reading clubs, and group therapies. It was the subtle testimony that anyone can fall, but it's the way they get up that changes everything. Emily read the book alone on a silent night. He cried at several points. Not because she saw herself portrayed, but because she finally understood how much he had suffered in silence. And for the first time, she felt proud of him, even from a distance. He kept the book by his bedside, as a reminder that choices have weight, but also that all pain can, eventually, teach. In the last chapter of this story, each character went their own way. None of them emerged unscathed. Everyone had to deal with the consequences of the choices they made. But therein lay the beauty. There was no free redemption. There was no forced return. Just maturing. Jonathan found himself again, rebuilt his dignity and discovered that true love begins from within. Emily learned to look in the mirror without running away, to accept her flaws and to rebuild her identity based on the truth. Lara found a balance between justice and empathy. And Helena, with her silent and respectful presence, showed that loving someone also means knowing how to let them breathe until they are ready to love freely again. And so this story ends. A story about betrayal, but above all, about consequences. A story where suffering was not free, and each tear served to build something new. A story where no one left as they entered, and that's what makes everything real. Because in life, not every wound needs to be fatal, but every wound needs to be felt so that healing can, one day, happen. Now that you've come this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? Which character touched you the most? Would you have done anything different? If you enjoy deep, intense and emotional stories, subscribe to the channel right now. This helps keep this work alive and brings more and more stories like this to you. And remember, here we do not support, encourage or romanticize betrayal. Our goal is clear, to show how it destroys and teaches. And that, in the end, the greatest betrayal anyone can commit, is against themselves.